The dust was the first thing. Not the fine, powdery kind that settles on windowsills, but thick, gritty plumes kicked up on the western horizon. 6 years later, carrying a familiar, impossible shape. Alara stood by the weathered fence rail, the same fence rail where she'd watched them ride out that cloudless morning. She was no longer the child who'd waved until the two figures on horseback dissolved into the shimmering heat haze. Now she was 18, her face leaner, etched with a quiet severity the intervening years had carved into her. The ranch house behind her stood silent, a monument to absence. 6 years of sun-baked silence, of dust and wind and the slow decay of hope. And now the dust again. 2 horses. Not just any horses. The powerful, muscled mustangs her father had bred. Their coats burnished copper and deep sorrel even from this distance. Fury and Ghost. Their names were a dull ache in her chest. She watched them approach, her breath catching, a cold dread coiling in her stomach. This wasn't how it was supposed to happen. They were supposed to come back with him. With them both. The world tilted precariously on its axis. Fury, the copper stallion, led the way, his gait weary but still proud. Ghost, the sorrel mare, followed close behind, head low. Their tack was gone, their flanks scarred with old wounds, but they were undeniably the same animals that had carried her father and herself on countless rides across this unforgiving land. A figure emerged from the stables, a man named Silas who had shown up 2 years ago and stayed. A quiet presence who worked the land with a grim efficiency, asking no questions, offering no solace, simply enduring. He stopped, watching the approaching horses, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes, recognition, perhaps, or just the stoic acceptance of the bizarre in a life already full of hardship. Alara felt a hot, stinging sensation behind her eyes. It wasn't joy, wasn't relief. It was the crushing finality of seeing them return alone. 6 years. Had they been running all this time? From what? To where? The question screamed in the silence of her mind. A torrent of anguish held back by a lifetime of learning to survive. The horses reached the fence line, blowing heavily, their eyes scanning the familiar, yet changed, landscape. Fury nickered low, a sound that ripped through Alara. It was a greeting, a lament, an echo from a life stolen. She took a step forward, her legs trembling, reaching out a tentative hand towards the fence. Ghost dipped her head, nudging the weathered wood, a ghost of a gesture from a world away. The sun beat down, relentless and indifferent. The dust settled, coating everything in a fine, brown film. The horses stood there, exhausted, silent witnesses to a story they could not tell. Leaving Alara standing at the precipice of a grief she thought she had already plumbed the depths of, only to find it was an abyss. Silas moved towards the gate, his movements slow and deliberate, his gaze fixed on the animals. He didn't look at Alara. No words were needed. The return of the horses was a proclamation more devastating than any spoken sentence. It was the closing of a chapter she had desperately clung to, leaving her alone with the ghosts of memory and the heavy weight of unanswered questions. The ranch, which had felt merely empty before, now felt haunted. Silas opened the corral gate with a low creak, his attention solely on the 2 weary horses. He moved with a quiet competence that had always both frustrated and reassured Alara. He rarely spoke, his face a landscape of weathered lines that gave away nothing. He coaxed the horses inside, his voice a low murmur that was barely audible, a stark contrast to the boisterous calls her father used to use. Alara remained rooted to the spot by the fence, watching as Silas inspected the animals. He ran a knowledgeable hand along Fury's flank, checked his hooves, examined the old scars. Each touch was careful, respectful. The horses seemed to accept his presence, his quiet authority, with the same passive endurance they carried in their eyes. He found a patch of dried blood near Ghost's shoulder, probing it gently. Alara watched, her mind a chaotic storm. Where had they been? What had happened? The horses were here, tangible proof of survival. Yet their very presence confirmed the worst fears she had lived with for 6 long years. She walked slowly towards the corral, the dust muffling her footsteps. The smell of horse sweat and dry earth filled the air. Closer now, she could see the exhaustion etched into the horses, the way their muscles quivered slightly. They weren't the sleek, powerful animals that had galloped away that morning. They were survivors, battered and worn. Silas straightened up, noticing her approach for the first time. He met her gaze briefly, his eyes dark and unreadable, before returning his attention to Ghost. There was no pity in his look, no explanation offered, just the quiet, shared reality of the moment. "Silas," she said, her voice rough from disuse and emotion. "How?" He shook his head slowly, his gaze still on the mare. "They came back," he stated, stating the obvious, the only truth available. It was his longest sentence in weeks. It offered nothing. Alara swallowed. Feeling the familiar sting of tears she refused to shed. She wouldn't break, not now. Not in front of him. Not in front of the horses. She stepped closer to the fence, reaching out her hand tentatively towards Ghost. The mare lifted her head, her dark eyes fixed on Alara. For a long moment, they simply regarded each other across the weathered wood, a silent acknowledgement of shared history, of loss, of a bond that transcended the missing years. Ghost took a hesitant step forward, stretching her neck, and nudged Alara's hand with her soft muzzle. It was a familiar gesture, one that unlocked a flood of memories, her father's laughter, the wind in her hair as they rode, the smell of leather and horse and freedom. A sob caught in her throat, a sharp, painful gasp. She buried her face in the mare's mane, the rough hair comforting, real. Silas watched them, his expression unchanged. He walked over to a trough, starting to pump water slowly, the squeak of the handle the only sound other than Alara's ragged breathing. He didn't offer comfort, didn't try to pull her away. He simply allowed her this moment, this reconnection with the past that had returned, brutally incomplete. His silence was not indifference. She was beginning to understand it was simply silence, a quiet acceptance of things that had no easy answers. The days bled into weeks, marked by the rhythm of the ranch and the silent presence of the returned horses. Alara fell into a routine dictated by necessity. Feeding the horses, cleaning the stalls, helping Silas with the endless chores the land demanded. There was little conversation. Silas worked from sunup to sundown, his movements economical, his focus unwavering. Alara worked alongside him, initially clumsy, her grief a heavy shroud, but gradually, the physical labor became a form of release, a way to channel the restless energy born of unanswered questions and simmering pain. She learned to mend fences, stack hay, tend to the smaller cuts and bruises the horses inevitably acquired. Silas didn't teach her with words, but with example. He would perform a task and she would watch, then try to replicate it. If she struggled, he might offer a silent adjustment, a hand placed on hers to guide the hammer, a subtle shift in his own stance to show her a better way to lift. It was a strange form of communication, built on observation and shared effort, devoid of the emotional complexities that words might bring. She watched him with the horses, too. He was patient, firm, speaking to them in low tones, understanding their needs with an instinct that seemed almost innate. He treated Fury and Ghost with the same quiet respect he showed the land, acknowledging their wildness while providing for their needs. There were moments, brief and fleeting, when the silence between them felt less like an absence and more like a space filled with unspoken understanding. Working side by side, pitching hay into the stalls under the vast, indifferent sky, they were two solitary figures bound together by circumstance and the silent specter of loss. Alara began to notice details about Silas. The way his eyes creased at the corners when he was concentrating, the callous strength of his hands, the faint scar that ran along his jawline. He ate his meals quickly, sparingly, always keeping a quiet vigil. She never saw him idle. He seemed to have no past, no connections beyond this land and the work it required. Yet, there was a quiet resilience in him, a refusal to be broken by the harshness of their existence, that she found herself drawing strength from. He didn't try to fill the void her father had left. No one could. But his steady presence, His silent competence anchored her in the present, pulling her away from the paralyzing grip of the past. One evening, a sudden storm blew in, the wind whipping dust and debris, the sky turning a bruised purple. Alara rushed to secure the barn doors, struggling against the force of the wind. Silas was already there, his back braced against the heavy wood, his muscles straining. Without a word, she moved to the other door, bracing herself against it. They stood there together in the roaring wind, two figures holding back the storm, united by a shared necessity that needed no explanation. When the worst had passed, leaving only the drumming of rain on the roof, they secured the doors and walked back to the house through the driving rain. He didn't offer her his coat, didn't ask if she was cold. But as they reached the porch, he paused, glancing at her briefly before stepping inside. It was the longest look he had given her, a silent acknowledgement of their shared vigil, a quiet recognition of the strength she hadn't known she possessed until this moment. The horses nickered softly from the barn, safe from the storm, their presence a constant, silent reminder of the mystery that lingered, unresolved, between them. The storm passed, leaving the air clean and sharp, the scent of wet earth heavy on the breeze. Life on the ranch resumed its quiet, demanding rhythm. Alara felt a shift within her, a hardening, a deepening of the resilience that had been forged in the crucible of her grief. The horses, rested and recovering, were a part of this new reality, their presence a silent testament to survival, not just their own, but perhaps her own. She rode Ghost now, tentatively at first, the mare's familiar gait both comforting and unsettling. It wasn't the same as riding with her father, his strong presence beside her, his laughter carried on the wind. It was different. It was solitary, a quiet communion with the animal that had been his companion, a silent exploration of the land they had shared. Silas watched her ride sometimes, his gaze following her across the fields from where he worked. He said nothing about it, just as he said nothing about the empty saddle that should have been beside hers. But his silent acknowledgement felt like a form of permission, a quiet acceptance of her need to reclaim this part of her life. The world outside the ranch continued, indifferent to their isolated existence. There were whispers in the nearest town, questions about what had happened, speculation fueled by the sudden, unexplained return of the horses 6 years later. Silas deflected any inquiries with curt, non-committal answers, his stoicism a shield against the idle curiosity and judgment of strangers. Alara remained on the ranch, protected by Silas's quiet vigilance and the sheer isolation of the land. She knew the questions would always linger, the mystery of those 6 years a permanent shadow. But the focus had shifted. It was no longer about uncovering the past, but about building a future. One sparse afternoon, while mending a fence post, Silas spoke, his voice low against the vast silence. "They were running," he said, not looking at her, his hammer striking the nail with quiet precision. Alara paused, her own hammer suspended mid-air. "Running from what?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He drove the nail home, straightening up slowly. He finally looked at her, his dark eyes holding a depth she hadn't seen before. "Doesn't matter now," he said, his gaze sweeping across the endless horizon. "What matters is here," he gestured around them, at the land, the ranch house, the horses grazing peacefully in the distance. And now it wasn't an explanation, not a full one, but it was more than he had ever offered. It was an invitation to leave the haunting past behind and focus on the tangible reality of their present. Alara looked at him, at his weathered face, his steady gaze. She saw not a stranger, but a fellow survivor, a silent partner in this harsh, beautiful existence. The mystery of the 6 years remained, a raw wound that would likely never fully heal. But standing there, the sun warm on her face, the vast sky overhead, the horses a quiet presence nearby, Alara felt a sense of hard-won peace. She had faced despair, endured isolation, and found a quiet strength she hadn't known she possessed. She had lost her father, but she had not lost herself. And in the shared silence and quiet partnership with Silas, She found not a replacement for what was lost, but a different kind of connection, one built on resilience, necessity, and a shared understanding of the weight of the world. The horses, Fury and Ghost, lifted their heads in the distance, silent guardians of the land and the secrets it held. They had returned, bringing echoes of the past, but they also stood as a symbol of endurance, a quiet promise of the future that could be built, piece by painstaking piece, right here, in this place that was now hers to protect.